as you can see, there's been a transformation in the petroleum sector already with the name change from PIB to PIA. Okay, well, that might sound like it's a little on the comical side, but then there is a lot more to it now as an act as opposed to it being a bill, a proposition. Now it's a law that has to be implemented, and a number of things have already begun to show up. The most prominent so far of which is the word percentage. 3%, 30%, 65%, and all of that. And what they all mean for the average Nigerian, especially the host communities. So much to unpack on that one, but it's a conversation that will continue to take place, especially with regard to the diversity of opinions about the whole law. Joe Nwakwe joins us this morning. He is former chairman, Society of Petroleum Engineers, Nigerian Council. He is former SA to the Honorable Minister of State for Petroleum and partner Zera Advisory and Consulting. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
He is also here along with Israel Aye, who is partner, commercial and energy law practice, Candelp, and director, Aspen Energy. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin with you, Mr. Nwakwe. You have seen all of this. Perhaps you want to, first of all, help us understand, are we overly focusing on inanities? Some would say there is definitely a lot more to talk about concerning the Petroleum Industry Act. But the one that's most prominent now concerns the percentage, the host communities, and as opposed to the one to the frontier basin. Do you think that that attention is necessary, or it's a diversion?
Well, I think it has to do with our country, right? The law has many components. The law we have today deals with a whole lot of things that affect the industry. And I've said before, the industry contributes 60-70% of our total revenue. So it's important that we pay attention. Nigerians should know. But whether we focus on the host community provisions, it's just a minor bit. Remember, prior to this period, we were looking at 4 bills out of this. And the host community is just one of 4. So if all the focus is on this quarter, then something is wrong. The bill looks at the fiscal arrangement, which is probably the most critical piece in this puzzle. It talks about the institutional framework. It talks about the administration of the industry, which everybody agrees has had problems. And then it talks about the host community. So if we all focus on the host communities, it doesn't do justice to the other components. I think the industry is more concerned with the fiscal arrangements in the industry because that's where the money is.
And I think, pardon me, so which do you think is better? Because you referenced that plan of bundling, break it down. Do you think it's better to, to have passed and signed it this way as one unit, or to have broken it down as was, muted in the past?
Well, looking back today, I think what worked is the best, right? What worked is that we did it as one and we got it to pass. We've tried 4 and we couldn't pass even 1. So I will imagine that looking back, people will say, we wish we did this, took this route earlier. But, nevertheless, we have a new law. I think it's, if you ask me, it's probably a 70-80% in ranking. There's no perfect law anywhere. Okay. So directionally, is where we've done the right thing. Okay.
Mr. Aye, what do you think? Is our attention on this significant? Maybe I should even ask you this way. How significant do you think this attention to the details concerning the host communities is?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by agreeing with Joe that it is something of a red herring and perhaps an easy sound bite and perhaps a distraction in some sense. And I probably will explain what I mean by that. And again, in our environment, we're prone to being sensational. We like sound bites. We like the things that trend, and those things that we can fly with. But in terms of informing people, let's even take some of the numbers. To take the host communities numbers. So when you say 10%, 5%, 3% of what? 10% that was proposed around about 2008 and 2009. In fact, I think the 10% was floated around the 2012 iteration, because we remember some of that history. And 10% was supposed to be 10% of the profit of the operating companies. Now, if you understand how many of the upstream operating companies are set up or established, they are deliberately set up as loss-making entities. Okay? As loss-making entities, because the structure of the joint venture arrangement is such that you win, work, and carry. What you share is crude. And then the profit-making element of that particular structure is the downstream entities that are largely not here. So if you went with 10% of zero, what you'll have gotten is zero. So what they've anchored back to now is a percentage of the operating expense of the previous year. And if I was to echo something the GMD said, he said, look, what we should be focusing on is the absolute value that this delivers in terms of benefits transfer to the communities. The absolute value that this delivers to the communities. So we're talking about a global potential, the potential for a global fund of about $500 million to the communities. And you have to make a distinction between benefits transfer to the communities and a development agenda for the region. This is the first time that we're coming up with a framework that seeks to directly deliver benefits to the communities where petroleum operations are taking place. That being the case, it is something to chair. Of course, it may not address the issue of forgive me if I say the more emotive issue of resource control, which is a different argument altogether. But in terms of...
My apologies, but that emotive angle is quite significant to some. Perhaps that's why the attention is so serious, because the money is an issue, the numbers are significant, but those emotive actions have cost lives. Perhaps that's the reason for the attention. I don't know how much of that has been addressed by this PIA, especially given if you retrospectively look at that judgment of a case that lasted 30 years, and that's just been finally agreed, and now we can move on with it. So those emotive issues, it would seem like to the people who are directly concerned, who have lost lives and livelihoods, they need to be addressed as well. What do you think?
Yeah, so the responsibility that those of us on this set and elsewhere have is to engage the issues, to articulate them, and to communicate what they are and what they mean to the public. And what I like about what you've said is to capture it. And I think you've captured both what I'm referring to as the emotional or the sort of social justice dimension of it, of resource control. Is a separate conversation. It's linked to some other socio-political and economic themes. We can engage those. It's different from environmental management. Thankfully, I think a number of provisions have been made that sort of cater to that. But the point I'm making is that as far as benefits transfer go, this is a good start. There's never been anything like it. We've set a framework that potentially delivers $500 million to the communities, and I have to note that, to the communities where petroleum operations take place, and that, in my opinion, is a good start. We need to address the things that you've highlighted, but those are separate issues.
Well, I'm glad we swallowed the frog, sort of, because that's been the major issue that has bedeviled this whole process. So let me bring this back to Mr. Nwakwe, because the PIA, it might take a while getting used to calling it the PIA. Yeah. It means different things to different people. So the host communities, we just try to deal with some of those issues, which, clearly the debate will go on, maybe till the next amendment and the rest. But to the operators as well, it means something else. To the government, it means something. Even to, to OPEC, for example, because, it impacts one of their operators or one of their major members, as it were. But as an expert in the field first, and I know we started off, what is the biggest win for you in this PIA, the biggest win?
Well, I'll think about it as a Nigerian. So for a Nigerian, one, we needed to have an attractive fiscal regime that will attract investment. If you realize that in the last 20 years, our production and output has been declining, right? And that means for an average Nigerian, less money into the federation account. So we need to, there's a relationship between your production levels and what ends up in the purse, right? So for Nigeria, we needed to attract, we don't have the money to invest. This is a capital intensive business. So we need to attract capital into the sector. The downstream was practically non-existent. The downstream was almost dying. The midstream didn't exist. The upstream was struggling. So for that money to come in, you needed a fiscal arrangement that attracts people with the money. So for me, that's a major, major win. Secondly, we're looking at the host community provisions. You might have a license to operate, which is what the government will give you, right? But your freedom to operate is the community. It's the man that says your truck can pass through his village to the next village. So if he's not at peace with you, your operations will be hampered negatively. So I think the community is a major piece, probably the second most important. And then we talk about the institutional and governance issues. Everybody understands the challenges we've had with NNPC. So anything that kind of changes that narrative is good for the average Nigerian. I mean, we want efficiency in the sector. We want things to work. The country benefits the most when that sector runs efficiently. And we just haven't gotten there. So this takes us a notch. Hopefully, if we implement, again, it's one thing to have a law. It's the other thing to implement it faithfully. So we need to always recapture the spirit and intent of the provisions in the bill or act right now.
But perhaps that also raises another crucial issue.
Yes.
I mean, there have been some governing laws in the sector over the years. How significantly do you think those laws or regulations impacted activities in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, we've had, if you think about on the fiscal side again, we had the PPT, Petroleum Profit Tax Act, the Deep Offshore and Inland Basins PSC Act. They have been successful to some degree, but it's one thing to be to deliver 100%, it's another thing to deliver 50 or 60%. So we've had...
My apologies. I asked that against the backdrop of the issue you raised about implementation.
Yes.
I'm asking if those systems that ran those laws previously were not able to do the needful, so to speak, do we have a system that the PIA will run on successfully, that the implementation of the PIA will run on successfully? Okay,
so one of the, big wins, if you ask me, is that we hope to end up with a stronger and more effective regulatory framework environment, right? So the implementation of laws are done through regulation. So if the regulator is competent, the outcomes will be a lot better than when you have an incompetent regulator. So we're ending up with a slightly better regulatory environment than we started out with. So I think that's important. That's a big, again, when we say implementation, if the regulator will not be competent, if the government does not pay attention, creating the agency is not what makes it efficient. So there's work to be done. You need to build capacity, regulatory capacity, right? And then special interest has to be managed.
So what does it mean specifically to build regulatory capacity? Because it's something we can just gloss over. What does that mean really?
I'll tell you what it means. It's simply put, get the right people to do the job. So whether you develop them in-house or you hire them, it really doesn't matter. The important thing is that the regulator has to be up to par. This is a high-tech industry. This is not selling paper, right? So we need to have regulators that understand the rule of the game and how to make it work. I
want to ask you more about that, especially speaking from your experience as former SA to the Minister of State for Petroleum. But let me ask Mr. Ayi, in terms of the governance, I mean, you have been in energy law practice, so you would understand some of the challenges that many people may not. I want to also talk about that governance, structure. Do you think we have that kind of governance structure? Speaking from, well, I can say that Mr. Wakwe is speaking from the government side, perhaps from his experience, but from your own private sector and legal, angle, do you see us having that structure? There are international organizations involved, there are local organizations involved, and then there is government. Do you think that structure is strong enough to bear the weight of the PIA?
Okay. So the role of people in operationalizing any sort of governance framework cannot be overemphasized. And I think that's why I would imagine that Joe Mwankwe has cut through the chase and just sort of gone to that. But let me say something, perhaps as a lawyer, about the role of the legal and fiscal framework in setting the tone, sort of setting the scene for any kind of development. I mean, it's design thinking, right? That's probably where we're coming at it from. That a lot has to do with design. I mean, I take the view essentially that order makes for growth. And I've heard this expression many times when people say things like, oh, Nigeria, the problem is not the laws. We have many laws in our books. It's implementation. And it's, maybe thinking more as a lawyer who's particularly interested in law and development, I say that that's not entirely correct. I mean, you cannot build a skyscraper on the foundation of a bungalow, of a one-story building. And that's probably the way to look at the petroleum industry, that if you look at the principal legislations, beginning with of the previous era, and so, of the previous era, notably the Petroleum Act, which was enacted in 1969, and then on the back of the Fiscal Act was the PPT, the Deepwater Act, so-called. It was a fiscal act, effectively. If you look at what was the framework of the petroleum industry, it was a little more than a licensing regime for upstream operations. Oil. And I need to add that it wasn't even a licensing regime for gas. I mentioned that the last time I was here, that it was a little more than that. And so if you picture somebody who's built a bungalow and decided to expand, and maybe the family is growing, and then you add a room here and you add a room there, that's fine. You can't build a skyscraper on that same foundation. If you want to take this to 10 stories, to 20 stories, you need to bring the house down, reconstruct the foundation, and get it up. Thankfully, I believe that we have that. And I agree with the previous speaker that it's probably somewhere in the 70, 80 sort of percent, and that's good for a law. So let me give you a sense of what we're talking about. You asked me specifically about governance, right? Now, what was the governance framework for the petroleum industry under the previous regime? The entire responsibility for policy, regulation was vested in one individual. The Petroleum Act vested every power, duty, responsibility about governing the industry in the person of the minister, whoever that is. And evidence of the fact that was the most pivotal, if you will, or most significant rule in the petroleum industry, or perhaps even in the country as it is today, is that at least 3 successive presidents in recent history, maybe not successive, have taken on the role of the petroleum minister in person. But what has happened with the Petroleum Industry Act now is that we've actually created an institutional framework.
But there are still some significant responsibility for the minister. I mean, for instance, you talked about, even in the governance, I mean, thankfully we're talking about the governance, the minister still has some significant responsibility in terms of general oversight and supervisory powers over all facets of the petroleum industry. That's one. Secondly, even in the appointments that Mr. Nwakwe mentioned the other time, a good number of them still have to come upon the recommendation or, the appointment of the president, who, at least as at this moment, is also the minister. So in terms of of governance, I mean, what do you see changing?
Well, again, we say these sort of things. You cannot leave the industry leaderless. And I personally, and we can debate this for as long as we want to, but personally, I think that leadership is key, okay? But you have to remember that Until now, what is known as the Department of Petroleum Resources was not a creation of law. It didn't have a statutory basis for its existence. In fact, its only legitimacy was the fact that it was a delegate of the minister's responsibility to regulate. So the DPR was not an entity known in that sense to, and I don't want to say non-known to law, it's just a group of people who were exercising the powers of the minister. Today you have a commission with a duly elected management, I mean, a board and management, I mean, at least on the books. Do you understand what we're saying? Of course, in terms of behavior and the rest, it will take a while for people to begin to adjust, to understand the scope of their powers and the rest of it. If you take, say, licensing as an activity, what we had was the minister may, you know, again, and because the minister may, and this is hinged on one individual, we haven't had a licensing round in how many years? In fact, it took over 17 years for us to get to a marginal field exercise, which has gone the way it's going, and we're waiting to see what the outcome is.
Okay.
But when you have an institution that is vested with the powers to conduct that according to global best practices, and then submit the outcome to the minister to award, that is a step change.
Okay. How significant is that for you, Mr. Nwakwe, the fact that these seemingly independent commissions and bodies are also appointed by the minister or by the president on the recommendation of the minister? Who is the president?
Well, it is what it, I mean, I don't know of any other institution in the country where the president, we have an executive presidency. So it derives from the constitution, actually. The powers of the president to whoever works for Nigeria is an appointee of Mr. President. That's fine. And in this case, I think the commission and the authority, they will need Senate confirmation. So that puts some additional checks and balances. So for me, it's not a problem. That's the same thing across every sector, really. I think the issue he's raising is that old habits die hard. Right?
Exactly.
So
people have a reason to be concerned.
So we've run an industry based on 1969 laws, where the minister was the all and all, and he did whatever he wanted. So now we are going back to one with structure, where roles and responsibilities are pretty better defined.
Also supervised by the same minister.
And that's fine. Somebody has to supervise, somebody has to give. So the political leadership has to have a point source that translates political aspirations to policy.
That's
right?
the issue.
So that's the role of the minister.
Just a second.
Yes.
That's the issue.
Yes.
The politics of it. Is what's the entry point for the people who are going to get into the system? But that's and a number of other states other issues we'll discuss when we come back from this break. Do stay with us. Well, thank you for staying with us. Mr. Israel Aye and Mr. John Nwakwe are still with us. Let me come to you, Mr. Aye. The concerns will be there. I mean, you just heard Mr. Nwakwe say just before the break, old habits die hard. And, you know, given the experiences that a number of people have had with, you know, the ministers or politicians being in office and supervising certain regulated, you know, areas of business, the concerns are still quite grievous. Take the Ministry of Communication and Digital Economy, for instance, and the overbearing influence, so to speak, on the NCC, the Minister of Information and Culture, and the media, you know, various sections of the media and all of that. And people are wondering, is that the same thing that is going to happen, especially in the light of this PIA, given the President and the Minister of Petroleum Resources such tremendous powers? How do you see that affecting the effectiveness or efficiency of the sector of the law?
Okay, I mean, so my attitude essentially is that we can't throw the baby and the bathwater away. I probably take the position that the powers of the minister under the Petroleum Industry Act are not as omnipotent or they're not as omnipotent and all-encompassing as they were under the Petroleum Act. And it's important to make that point, that under the Petroleum Act, they were totally unfettered. It was all-encompassing. It simply just said the minister may. There was no framework, no fetters, nothing. And Nigerians need to understand that we now have a structured governance framework, an institutional framework. We have set up regulators. We have set up, as a matter of fact, the only sort of missed opportunity for me is the policy support organization. And again, we didn't just have the will to eyeball that and to deal with it. What would have completed that cycle for me, no doubt, is to create a commission, like a Petroleum Commission or Directorate, whatever name you call it, to act as a policy support system for the minister, so that it will have perpetual succession, and minister in and minister out, it will be able to provide that kind of support. In my opinion, the Ministry of Petroleum, and I say this with great trepidation, which is a component of the civil service system, may not be adequately equipped to provide that kind of support to the minister. And again, if you think about the fact that the NNPC Corporation is about to transform into a purely commercial entity, it will feel to me that the minister is left largely to sort themselves out, and it will then depend on what sort of network they can arouse and what kind of team they can gather around themselves. But even if a minister raises a good team, you may not have what I call perpetual succession, or continuity of policy policy thrust. That for me perhaps was the opportunity missed,
right.
And I don't know if there will be a chance to deal with it. Other than that, we have a framework, and remember what I said earlier, that order makes for growth.
I said earlier on that this act means different things to different people. I mean, you've spoken as a stakeholder, an operator, as it were, in that sector. But we have other operators that might not be registered, the Nigerian people, for example. And, I mean, that makes up a huge population of the stakeholders in that particular sector. And for a lot of people, the question has been, okay, we saw the process of the lawmaking. They saw the scuffles, by the way, earlier in the year with the host communities. They saw the process, the debate on the floor of the House and the Senate, and the eventual scuffles as well, the whole drama that played out. And the question the average Nigerian is asking right now is, so what does this mean for me? So when I go to the filling station, for example, what does it mean for the price of petrol, for the price of kerosene, diesel, gas? I mean, we saw some things on the front page this morning relating to the sale of gas. So let's start from the wins, maybe, for the average Nigerian who uses petroleum products. When you look through the act, what do you see that you think Nigerians should be excited about? That's for Mr. A first, then I'll come to Mr. Nwakwe.
Okay, so thank you very much. Again, if I echoed something that my friend and colleague said earlier, it is that it is for the Nigerian people that we are here. I mean, if we wanted to have a conversation with ourselves, we can pack ourselves into an echo chamber and talk the terms we know and can relate to. But let me say something quickly about what that should mean. I mean, this is a win for Nigeria. In the sense, let me start with the big picture and see how far I can get with it. In the sense that for the first time, we actually have deliberately designed legal and fiscal framework for incubating a petroleum industry. As a matter of fact, I have taken the position before now that we have either no petroleum industry or a fledgling petroleum industry. What we've had, particularly with respect to upstream operations, is a mining or extractive industry. And you need to know the distinction. What do I mean by that? Because the main activity is to win, to work, and to carry away. The focus of the so-called Nigerian petroleum industry was export. But in order for you to have a genuine petroleum industry, any kind of industry, you need two conditions: domestic participation and indigenous participation and domestic utilization of the product. Now, what this has done is to create a framework for birthing a midstream. This is where you're going to create jobs. So it's not about the price of petroleum. So for example, talk about the price of petroleum products. You're not going to be able to affect the price of petroleum products if you cannot affect the supply, the capacity to supply. There's no way. If you want to affect price, you're going to create subsidies, and which is unfortunately what we've had, where we're literally spending all we earn in crude sales to subsidize the importation of PMS and DPK, which does not make any sense at all. A lot of which find their way to other parts of the sub-region.
So if you can break that down the more, I'll come to Mr. Nwakwe, but just to even break that down, because I want Nigerians to leave with a sense of, okay, this is what to expect in the next month, in the next 6 months, and the rest. And I'll still stay with the price of petroleum products because, I mean, the average Nigerian has to purchase these things, I mean, perhaps every other day or weekly. So what would happen in the short term, mid-term? Maybe we can even talk about the long term.
So, I mean, again, I don't want us to make this about a petroleum product price conversation. And I know that a lot of people out there, our viewers, are interested in this. But the point to make is that if you take the upstream, which is what we associate, so when you talk about the petroleum industry in Nigeria, a lot of times we're thinking upstream and we're thinking petroleum products, right? So if you take upstream, for example, how many people does the upstream employ in Nigeria? I mean, in total, how many people? Directly, 20,000 tops. Indirectly, maybe 100,000. What is that in the context of the whole thing? So what do you need to have? You need to have more refining. You need to have more processing. You need to have all the you need to activate and energize the value chain in order to be able to create value. So we're moving from rent to value. And that framework is what we've put in place. It's like a large ship that is plowing water and going in a specific direction. If you change course, it will take a while for it to become apparent that you've changed course. And I'd like to say, if we have any sort of trust element, that we have changed course.
I sort of get a sense that you're saying, well, it might get a bit harder from here, but it only gets better after the harder. Am I right?
Okay, you're putting words in my mouth now.
I just want to be sure that's what I'm hearing, because maybe you're saying it without saying it, so let me be clear.
I'm probably saying that things wouldn't happen as quickly as we think they would, but in terms of, you know, navigational direction, we've changed course.
I've spoken like a true legal practitioner.
I thought I was the only one that thought that, actually. I thought I was the only one that thought talk about that one.
So, Mr. Nwakwe, your thoughts on this? Because whether you like it or not, that's the thought in the mind of the Nigerian. So, should we brace up, really? And I think it's important to actually tell Nigerians, should they brace up that, okay, the next maybe 6 months, it might be tricky, but then it's only for the better?
Yeah, I think that point has been made, even if you didn't say it exactly that way. I think the next couple of months will be a bit stormy, because change comes at some pain. The Act seeks to deregulate the market. So now what does that mean? It means that product prices will be market determined. Now we've seen all other products except PMS have been deregulated. So essentially, we've seen, you know where diesel is right now, okay? So that's a deregulated market. So what would that mean for the average Nigerian? It means that prices at the pump will go up, ultimately. Will they pay more? That's slightly a different conversation, because we are paying a whole lot more today. We tend to think that what we pay for PMS is what we pay at the pump. I hold the view that we pay a lot more than that, because when somebody takes money from FAC to pay that difference that we call subsidy, we are still paying.
They're taking your money, my money to pay eventually.
That's what it is. So basically we gave some that way and gave some at the pump. But I think that once we shut down this other back channel, right, we will see a slight bump in price at the pump. So for the average Nigerian, again, I'll use that word, he will think he's paying more. But I think that if the efficiencies we saw in the diesel market, and there are numbers to show that we actually pay the least amount for diesel in this sub-region today, right? So if the efficiencies...
That's with the deregulation?
Yes. And so there are benefits to full deregulation. We've seen it with diesel, we've seen it with every other product. So if those efficiencies are translated to the PMS market, I think that the average Nigerian will ultimately, not in the near term, but maybe in the medium term, be a lot better off.
I think the challenge, my apologies, Mr. Walker, I think the challenge with that fact that you're raising, that you gentlemen are raising, is in the communication of it to the people. Over time, as my colleague was trying to ask, just to be clear, there has been all of that communication about, look, Nigerians should brace up, but it would seem like the people who are advising Nigerians to brace up are not using the same braces. So, it's natural for people to be concerned that, look, if we're going to have to pay more, what are the people who are giving us this? What are they doing? This has grossly dissipated the trust quotient. So, how do we communicate that? That is the issue.
So what, like I said, you have to look at this as a system, right? So, if we're not dipping our hands into FAC to subsidize petroleum products, FAC should have more money, right? So the states and local governments and the federal government should get a bit more money.
All ifs, by the way.
Yeah, and that's the best I can do, really. So the question is, how does that translate to better life for the average person? I hope we can hold our political leaders responsible for that.
How does the law help us to do that?
This law is outside the purview of an industry law, and this is important. What the law says is that, well, we will allow the market to determine prices of products. But by the way, before we wrap up on that, I would like us to go back. He talked about jobs. One of the key wins in this law is that it opens up the midstream that didn't quite exist. Right? So if we get it right, and that's where, in terms of the capacity to generate jobs, it has the biggest potential. He just threw up a number of 30,000 direct jobs in the upstream. Yeah. The downstream has probably 200,000 direct jobs today. And if we get the midstream, it can do 10 times this combined. Because that's where you have refining, processing. So those are big monsters, right?
Good question. My apologies, because we're running out of time. Good issue you raised there, but how does that really affect the refining? Speak to us as a former SA to the Minister of Petroleum Resources. How does that really help, this law? How does it help, in the refining process? What does it do to the existing refineries, and especially also what are perhaps added to the refineries that have been licensed? Many of them have not been able to take off.
Excellent. So part of what it does in the midstream, it creates what we call the Midstream and Downstream Infrastructure Fund. That fund is expected to invest proceeds into startups in the midstream and downstream. So that would de-risk some of these projects. So some of these licensed refineries are not going forward because the promoters either do not have, or there are significant risks to it. If the state takes equity, for instance, through this fund in those investments, right, they will come on stream, because investors will have a lot more confidence that you're putting your money where your mouth is, right? So it is expected that investment from that fund would de-risk several projects in the midstream space. So that is important as well. Okay. And I say for tax revenues, for jobs, the midstream is where our hope is, right? So I expect that to happen. The other thing that we haven't quite looked at is cost. Before now, we did not have a statutory cost control mechanism in the sector. So basically, we rewarded efforts. So if you say you're building a pipeline, we say, okay, we'll give you capital allowance. Go build a pipeline. That's an incentive, right? Whether gas flowed through that pipeline or not, we've given you tax credits already, right? Incentives. So now, the thinking is that no. So the government ended up giving incentives to people who invested in things that did not make appropriate returns, right? So the thinking has changed, that the law says we now have something that rewards not effort, but outcome.
Before we run away on this, Mr. Wakwe, let me bring in Mr. Aye, because I remember earlier on he said that old habits die hard. I think that's what you said. And I mean, fantastic laws, even though you have an issue with, that saying fantastic laws, very hard to implement. But what will happen now? Because clearly we're going to have a commission, an authority, which we did not have before. You'll expect that, the appropriate government agencies will push this, who, by the way, may need training and some sort of retraining. So what happens after a law like this is signed, into an act? What will follow such that we can have quick or very excellent implementation?
Okay, thank you very much. And which is, like this question and even the previous one, which sort of Joe was responding to, and that is the fact that I believe that the petroleum industry should be the business of all Nigerians. My attitude essentially is that the natural resource space is a trust space, okay, and that everybody who has the privilege to interact with it does so in trust for not only the generation you're in, but for the generation that is supposed to come. So a significant component of that particular industry is accountability, yeah? And in order for us to be able to hold those who make decisions on our behalf accountable, we need to even know what the framework is. So those of us who have had the privilege of interacting with the subject, as long as we have, and have some insight into it, should learn to communicate the issues in plainer language, to pull out the issues in order to empower Nigerians through the various laws, the Freedom of Information, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative provisions, which, by the way, have been grandfathered into this law. So under this law now, you can no longer, so the whole sort of confidentiality of commercial arrangements have been dispensed with.
Okay.
If the average Nigerian, or any Nigerian for that matter, can actually request information from the government with respect to payments and those sort of arrangements. But let me just say this thematically, that what we need to do to add as a component to the management of this entire framework is accountability.
Okay.
Nigerians need to hold everyone that have entrusted with this accountable.
Now, how that is going to happen, that's another conversation altogether. But we have to thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of our conversation this morning. John Wakwe is former chairman, Society of Petroleum Engineers, Nigerian Council, and former SA to Honorable Minister of State for Petroleum. He is also partner, Zera Advisory and Consulting, alongside Mr. Israel Aye, who is a partner, Commercial and Energy Law Practice Candel, and is Director, Aspen Energy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So Sunrise Daily comes on next with this issue.